Yes, I still think the New Orleans Saints should consider signing safety Justin Simmons. We got all of that and a little bit of lagniappe for you on today's episode of Locked On Saints.
You are Locked On Saints, your daily New Orleans Saints podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What is good, Who Dat Nation and Who Dat family? I am your host, your friend, Ross Jackson, New Orleans native, your New Orleans Saints expert and credentialed member of the media covering those New Orleans Saints as a senior writer and reporter over at Saints News Network. And on today's episode of Locked On Saints, we're going to take a look at the New Orleans Saints potentially remaining here in New Orleans for up to the next 3 decades. Why that is huge news for New Orleans Saints fans, besides the obvious. We're also going to take a look at how bringing in more competition in the trenches is still not only recommended, but in my opinion, necessary for the New Orleans Saints. And yes, I still believe the New Orleans Saints should consider at least pursuing safety Justin Simmons, and a late push would very, very much be worth it, especially with a recent move across the NFL taking another suitor off the table. We appreciate you very much, as always, for making Locked On Saints your first listen of the day every day, and for being an everydayer here on the show, which is a proud part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Today's episode brought to you by your friends at Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use the promo code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off of your first purchase. Terms apply. Last minute tickets, lowest price guaranteed with Game Time. All right, so is there a deader horse than that which I have beat throughout this entire offseason than the New Orleans Saints should sign Justin Simmons? Maybe the only one, maybe the only horse that I have been more consistent with throughout this offseason is that Chris Olave will be a star in 2024, and why Rashid Shaheed should be considered within that class as well. However, my thing around Justin Simmons has been nothing if not consistent, but also nothing if not always sort of feeling slightly unwarranted, right? Like, do the Saints really have that big of a need at safety? I think the argument can be made that they don't have that big of a need at safety, not one big enough to go out there and spend a bunch of money on a Justin Simmons. Sure, I'll give you that, but I do think that we've seen the New Orleans Saints over and over and over again, at least in past years and in past practice, show that never stopping to look for opportunities to improve, especially on the defensive side, has been anything but their MO. That's sort of been what it is that they do. Right? You think back to, drafting Paulson Adebo, signing Janoris Jenkins even before that, then drafting Alontae Taylor, then drafting Jordan Howden. Now this year, having drafted Kool-Aid McKinstry, they've been pretty set with the secondary and defensive backs being their strongest unit, not only on their defense, but really on the team. And they've never, ever, ever stopped adding talent to that room. It's been a big part of what they do. Dennis Allen loves to drive competition over on the defensive side. It's sort of part of what has made the defense operate the way that it has since 2017, is constantly investing in talent there. And Justin Simmons, at just 30 years old, is a talented player that would be pretty, dare I say, electrifying next to a Tyrann Mathieu. He can play down in the box, he can cover, he can split roll, he can be a deep safety, he can rush the passer, he can, guard a tight end and all these other things. And I think having guys like Johnathan Abram and Will Harris and Justin Simmons and Ugo Amadi around is only good for Jordan Howden's continued development. And again, the Saints really don't have right now a backup middle of the field safety that could very well be Jordan Howden with the addition of Justin Simmons. So I also don't think that adding a Justin Simmons to the safety room means bad news for Jordan Howden nor his development, which is something that I think is important to the New Orleans Saints. But I think one of the things that sort of makes me come back to this again is because training camp is right around the corner. This is typically the time where you might see some of these veterans start to sign contracts, those that haven't signed contracts yet, right? Not wanting to go to voluntary this, voluntary that, mandatory mini camps and all that. They're just like, let me just sign a contract, show up for training camp, and then get this going. This is kind of the time where those types of signings take place. I believe we've seen such things with the New Orleans Saints really in previous seasons as well. And so I look at this as that, right? This is a good time to revisit this conversation, but also one of the teams that actually had Justin Simmons in for a visit, the Tennessee Titans, look to have potentially filled their safety role by signing Jamal Adams. And while I don't necessarily think that a signing like Adams actually makes your safety core better, just based on what he has been over the course of the past few years or so, the Titans might look at this as an opportunity that they're all kind of sealed up. The other team that looked pretty active in the safety market was the Miami Dolphins, and they went on and signed Marcus May. Who's going to tell them? I don't know. I'm sure they'll figure it out, but that's another team to where, there was that safety conversation next to Javon Holland and how they would continue to build around that. And I think they have one of the best young safeties in the NFL in that guy. But, they wanted to add one of those veterans and stuff like that. So maybe Justin Simmons would have been a good option for them. But the Saints still have kind of this open competition, even though Johnathan Abram seems to be firmly implanted as it's his job to lose there. They still technically have that competition available and that spot available next to Tyrann Mathieu. And Justin Simmons would immediately become that guy in that room next to Tyrann Mathieu if the Saints were to go out and sign him. And of course, as I've mentioned before, in case you haven't heard it, Justin Simmons has a lot of ties here to New Orleans and the coaching staff. Joe Woods, New Orleans Saints defensive coordinator, he worked with in Denver. Marcus Robertson, New Orleans Saints defensive backs coach, he worked with in Denver. Justin Simmons has made appearances here in New Orleans at the HBCU Legacy Bowl, spent the majority of that game on the sideline talking to New Orleans Saints defensive backs coach Marcus Robertson. So there's a lot of that there, right? So, and there's been enough New Orleans Saints in Denver over the course of the past year with Sean Payton having gone over there that either Justin Simmons has heard things that he likes about the New Orleans Saints, or he's heard things that he doesn't like about the New Orleans Saints. And that could play a role too, based on what he's been told by whoever it is that he has spoken to. So sure, those things could potentially be a factor as well. But I have a hard time seeing a real valid reason not to pursue a Justin Simmons for this New Orleans Saints team. I understand they want development for their young guys. I understand that they want, they really believe in Johnathan Abram. And I don't think that this is an indictment on Johnathan Abram. I just think that when there's a talent like Justin Simmons out there, you should consider talent like Justin Simmons that's out there, because it's very rare that a talent like Justin Simmons is indeed out there. I think the biggest thing is money, right? Do you have the money to pay him? What is he asking for? And if he's asking for anything, over where the New Orleans Saints are willing to pay, they're not going to budge, right? Like, they're going to look at the role. They're going to understand, well, we have these options. We want to bring in a guy like this to potentially upgrade the position, but would only be willing to go up to this amount. And if Justin Simmons wants any more than that amount, then it's a no-go. It's not going to happen. And that's great. I respect that about the New Orleans Saints. I respect that. And we've seen that over and over again from this team, from the Trey Hendricksons of the world to Mark Ingram, even at one point, so on and so forth, right? To kind of say, this is the money that we expect to pay for this role, and it's a slight upgrade from X, Y, and Z. And so do you want that? No, you want more? Okay, well, good luck finding it elsewhere. And that they'll kind of just say, okay, well, we're done here. So they'll set their price and they won't budge on that. But I still think that the pursuit of Justin Simmons is not a bad pursuit. It's not it is a pursuit that is worthwhile in terms of checking in this late, making one more push or another push. I don't know, maybe first push, who knows, to see if maybe that is something that might work out for the New Orleans Saints. I think you'd feel really, really good. You already feel good about the secondary. I think you'd feel really, really good about the secondary with an addition like Justin Simmons. Coming up next, I've made the argument before the New Orleans Saints should find it very much worthwhile to continue to drive competition in the trenches. Now, I think it's a necessity. Let's get to that as we continue on with today's episode of Locked On Saints, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. This show is sponsored by BetterHelp. BetterHelp Therapy Online has been awesome for me. It is a constant in my life. I was talking to somebody the other day, and as I was going through the conversation, I was like, you know what? This is probably a conversation I should have with my therapist. And so I stepped away for a moment, sent a message, because it doesn't have to be like a video message or a phone call. You could even just send a message that says, hey, here's how I'm feeling right now. What do you think? And then they'll say, hey, we should probably talk about this, or like give you some stuff. Like it's awesome. Like, it was great to just have like that resource that I could just step away from and get quick help in terms of what I needed in that moment. That's what I love about BetterHelp: immediacy, convenience, flexibility, all of that. So if you've been thinking about trying therapy, please give BetterHelp a try so that you can make your brain your friend with BetterHelp. So go and check it out today, betterhelp.com/lockedon. That'll get you 10% off of your first month. Once again, that is BetterHelp, HELP.com/lockedon. All right, family. Not only is it recommended that the New Orleans Saints continue to drive competition in the trenches, both on the offensive side and the defensive side, I think at this point, it's worth calling it a necessity. I think it's very much worth the New Orleans Saints time. And I also want to take a look at tight end. Like, is adding another tight end, Jimmy Graham, something that could potentially happen for this team? We'll hop into all that here as we continue on today's episode. We appreciate you very much, as always, making us your first listen of the day every day. Don't forget to go and check out Locked On Sports today, 24/7 stream program specifically to give you all the biggest stories from around the world of sports, brought to you by the folks that actually know the teams. No guessing, no question marks, nothing like that. No referencing players that have been retired for near a decade. None of that kind of stuff. So go and check it out today over at Locked On Sports Today's YouTube page, as well as on the Amazon Fire TV channels app, which you can find for free as well. Appreciate you very much for checking them out over on the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. So I've made the argument before. Let's talk. I've made the argument before the New Orleans Saints should absolutely be looking at driving more competition when it comes to the offensive line in particular. I think that having competition there makes sense. I've mentioned bringing in David Bakhtiari, guys like DJ Humphreys, and others, looking towards the interior as well with Vaitai and all these others that could potentially be out there. It makes sense, right? Like, I think that one of the things that I've appreciated about what the Saints have done on their offensive line, which I don't think they have every answer that they want yet, which is fine. That's what training camp's for. You're looking for those answers at the time. But I think one of the things that I've appreciated and that I did like about their sort of approach to team building and roster management on the offensive line is getting veteran depth. I've mentioned this before on the show, but just as a recap, in the past, they've relied on young guys for their depth. Now they're relying on young guys to drive their improvement. And there's ups and downs with that, right? Having veterans that you can rely on in terms of your depth maybe gives you a little bit more security to where if the young guys can't drive that improvement, then you feel pretty good about the fact that you could fall back on a veteran. Makes sense. Driving for the improvement with the young guys means that you're finding people that are accustomed and built into the modern day of the NFL based upon what they've done very recently in college and, zone runs and all these other things that are kind of, the athletic build, getting to the second level, all these other things. I think all of that makes sense. But you've just got a lot of question marks over in the offensive line. So I do think that driving some of that competition makes a ton of sense. So where can they find it? So our good friend Bob Rose over at Saints News Network did a great article just laying out 5 or 6 players at each kind of position that you might look at and say, hey, that's a position to need for the New Orleans Saints, and kind of laid out some options. So when it comes to offensive tackle, Cameron Fleming, of the Broncos, 32 years old, has experience with Clint Kubiak on the offensive line, with Denver and all these other things. So maybe that's one and gives you, another good tackle option. David Bakhtiari was one of the best left tackles in the NFL until injury set in. Charles Leno, as well as Donovan Smith, give you some versatility and things like that. Dwayne Brown is somebody that's approaching 40 years old, but still pretty good on the offensive line. Kind of reminds me of the Trey Turner signing last year. Trey Turner wasn't that far along in his career when they signed him, but he's a later career guy, kind of in that David Bakhtiari range, that Charles Leno range of 32, 33 years old when he was signing with New Orleans. And then unfortunately had the injury, but it does make sense. And then the youngest one on the list being DJ Humphreys, who really, is one of those guys that gives you a lot of versatility in terms of different positions that he can play, not just tackle versatility, but also the ability to be able to line up and move around anywhere. I just said that Trey Turner was like 32, 33 when he signed with the Saints last year. That's not right. He was only 30. He's 31 now. So, could we potentially see a return on the interior for a guy like Trey Turner, or them go for another guy like Connor McGovern or Gabe Jackson, some of these other guys that could potentially come in? I wouldn't be surprised to see, a guy like Max Garcia or something like that get another opportunity with New Orleans. Jerron Cage get another opportunity for New Orleans. I thought Jerron Cage actually played well in that Jacksonville game at right tackle when he had to step in place of literally everybody, right? It was like Ryan Ramczyk was down. Landon Young was, I believe Landon Young was down, or maybe he was playing a different position and all these other things. Like you just had to do so much on that offensive line last year when it came to health that made sense. So the bottom line is that like the veterans are out there, right? There are the options in terms of generating that competition. And I think that the competition just helps the young guys maybe get pushed a little bit further in terms of their development a little bit more quickly, all these other things. So that's why I look at driving competition there. I think you could bring in competition at edge rusher over on the defensive side too. Like as we talk about the trenches, some of the defensive trenches, I think the Saints are pretty set on their defensive interior. You've got guys that are specifically built and molded to the style of play that you want. Brian Brzee should take a huge step forward here in his second year. Colin Saunders, Nathan Shepard should take huge steps forward in their second year in the system as well. Then you've got, Christian Boyd, who I think, who the Saints drafted in the 6th round, that I think should be the 4th defensive tackle on this roster. He had a pretty impressive OTAs, minicamp, stuff like that. So I'm pretty okay actually with where the Saints are on the interior. I wasn't for a little while, but after kind of seeing OTAs, minicamp, I actually started to feel a little bit better there. But, we'll see. I mean, even bringing some of these guys in on a tryout basis, just so that you have a recent check-in with them in case there's injuries and stuff like that. All makes sense. But when it comes to edge rusher, like I do think there are those opportunities to bring folks in. Bob lists a couple that I really like. Charles Harris, formerly of the Detroit Lions. Carl Lawson is another one. I forget about him all the time. He could be a guy that makes sense. Tyus Bowser is one that I mentioned that maybe is a little bit more of the Leonard Floyd type, like a smaller wire-framed, not wire-framed, but like, a smaller framed edge rusher. Emmanuel Ogbah is somebody that I really like, who can play inside and out, maybe come in and challenge the other young guys at that spot. Peyton Turner, Isaiah Foskey, all that. So I could see some value in that too. So I just think that continuing to build up the trenches, it's weird right now to have a team that is so driven to be competitive have question marks in the trenches be their biggest question marks. That's not typically where a competitive team wants to be. So we'll see. But I do think that continuing to drive that competition could make sense. If nothing else, it drives the development of some of those young guys. I wanted to speak on tight end as well. The thing about tight end that's really interesting is like the Saints, I feel like, are developing more and more need here every time that I talk about it. So maybe it's just that I'm talking about it too much in my mind, right? Or to myself. But I think that the big thing with that is, you have this injury to Juwan Johnson that was a little bit unexpected. It was very much unexpected. That maybe causes a little bit of a wrinkle here and there in terms of wondering, can you bridge the gap with momentum, as we talked about here on the show before. And so maybe adding some other potential pass catchers. I don't think you're going to get more known commodities to add to this offense. Jeff Swain doesn't really help you very much. Tyler Kroft is 32. Bryson Hopkins was another guy that was on Bob's list, who I like a lot, who I liked a lot coming out of college, but has only flashed with the Rams. Really, like Jimmy Graham's the only one, and you got to wait for him to come back from his expedition across the Arctic Ocean. And then at that point, like, what is his football readiness? What is his, football conditioning? I mean, his conditioning is going to be fantastic. It's actually not the conditioning that I'd be worried about, but what's the muscle shape? What's the build? Like, are you ready for football? You know what I mean? And so can you bring him in and then him actually have an impact for you quick enough and all that? So I don't know. I think the biggest thing that you're really hoping for is that Foster Morrow turns out to be like super ready now in this new system, and that Dallin Holker surprises and is ready way more quickly than most undrafted free agent rookie tight ends, let alone rookie tight ends, are typically ready in the NFL. And I like those things happen, then sure, like you feel great. And then if Juwan Johnson is ready faster than expected, then also great, but just a lot of question marks there. So, but the interesting part is that like you don't really have a way to find an answer there. You don't have a way to go and get a proven something there when it comes to that position, unless you trade. But there's not really a lot of impact tight ends that are going to be able to be traded for at this point. Maybe that's a trade deadline move, but that would be about the closest that you can get there. All right, coming up next, I really want to take a look at the New Orleans Saints potentially signing up to 30-year lease. Why is it up to? What does that mean? How can it get done? All of that. I want to break all of that down as we continue on and wrap up today's episode of Locked On Saints, part of Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Today's episode of Locked On Saints brought to you by friends at Game Time. No better place to search for last-minute tickets and grab last-minute tickets than Game Time. If you're like me and you like planning moments in advance, a little bit of spontaneous, whether it's a date night, whether it's like taking the family out, whether it's just like, hey, you and the fam want to go out, you and the friends want to go out, just you want to go out, whatever it might be. Game Time is where I always jump on. What events are going on in the city and where can I, grab an affordable ticket? Game Time is the place to go. In fact, actually, typically, ticket prices go down closer and closer to the beginning of the event over at Game Time. So it doesn't get any better than that. It feels like they're obsessed with trying to find you the best possible deal on your ticket. So I recommend very much heading over to Game Time, taking advantage of all of their transparent tools and everything, all in pricing, views from your seats, and all of that. You can just take all the guesswork out of buying tickets with Game Time today. Download the Game Time app, create an account, use the promo code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off of your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, download the app and create an account. Use that promo code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off of your first purchase. Game Time. Go and check them out. Last minute tickets, lowest price guaranteed. Let's get it. Who Dat Nation? New Orleans Saints reportedly working on a deal to potentially remain in New Orleans for up to the next 30 years. I'm going to explain to you why this is a big deal because you didn't know it, but you've actually been hearing about this deal for the last little bit. I'll explain why. As we continue on, don't forget we are your team every day. We don't just say it, we live it here on the Locked On Podcast Network. So coming up tomorrow, midweek fundamentals. Let's rehash, go back through what the Clint Kubiak offense is expected to do, how it will get that done, and specifically how it will elevate some of the players. So we're going to really do kind of a deep dive and focus in on, especially with training camp about to get started. What are the players going to be asked to do? How does it maximize what it is that they do? Don't laugh. Stop it. And take a look at, what we are expecting to see and how it all relates to training camp, right? Because that's really where all this stuff starts to get really, really dug in deep on all that other stuff. So I want to jump into all of that as well. Really? I'm just kidding. I'm the one that made the deal about it. All right. So according to Jeff Duncan, the New Orleans Saints are pretty close to wrapping up a deal that would keep them in New Orleans for up to the next few decades. Now, I mentioned that you've actually been hearing about this deal without knowing that you're hearing about this deal for the last little bit. I found out, thanks to a source, that one of the reasons why you have actually been hearing about this is that apparently, from what I was told, the previous situation, remember when the Saints, there was that whole thing that happened where Saints ain't paying their bills, and then the Saints came back and they're like, bro, you ain't show me the papers, and then the LSAD's like, what papers though? And all this stuff. Well, apparently, what I was told is that those papers, or a part of what was a part of the equation of all this, I should say it that way, a part of the equation of all this stuff was that the stadium administration and all this other stuff actually wanted to try to get a 10-year deal done with the New Orleans Saints that tied them not only to the city of New Orleans, of course, but also with the stadium, right? With the Superdome, especially with them having invested so much in terms of these renovations and all these other things, which of course the Saints invested a lot in terms of those renovations too. So this is something that feels like it was kind of a no-brainer since everybody's investing in this. The state of Louisiana is investing in it. The New Orleans Saints are investing in it. Other organizations are investing in it, all this other stuff. So it makes sense. But that apparently was a part of the, kind of hold up, the little hiccup that they had at one point. But the idea here, as it seems to be stated, is that it would be a 10-year deal plus a few 5-year options basically after that could continue to set in to make it a total of a 30-year deal, which would be great because I'm not trying to put a timeline on anybody here, but that effectively connects the Saints to the city of Louisiana, listen to me, the city of New Orleans, the state of Louisiana, far beyond or at least beyond when Gayle Benson has control over the team. So that's big because that was one of the big question marks that had kind of lingered a little bit, was what happens with the team post Gayle Benson's ownership, right? There was the idea of it going into a will, and then, in the will going into a trust, and then it being split and all these other things. And so everybody was kind of wondering, like, okay, well, what if they get a new owner and that owner wants to move the team and stuff like that? This would effectively help to keep that from happening. Obviously, anything can happen. Any amount of money, certain amounts of money can certainly make things do things you don't expect that money to do. There's no doubt about that. But the idea here is that this would connect the team and the stadium and the city of New Orleans so that regardless of ownership, the agreement is in place to keep the Saints in New Orleans. The tricky part becomes what's the criteria for those little like 5-year pickups after that, right? 10 years. And then what is the criteria to stick around for the 5? And then what's the criteria for that next 5-year extension? What's the criteria for that next 5-year extension? Or however it is that they end up handling that, right? Is it 10-year extensions by the time it's all said and done? We'll see. We'll see which way it all goes. But that's one of the big things. So this is big for Saints fans because this has been a little bit of a lingering concern for Saints fans that not a lot of Saints fans like to talk about, right? What would happen post Gayle Benson to this team? This helps to answer that question. So that's pretty big for you as a Saints fan. That's big for the New Orleans Saints. It's huge for the city of New Orleans. It's huge for the Superdome and the commission around that as well. Who, obviously, they're doing all these renovations and everything like that. The last thing you'd want to do is fund all of these renovations and then be like, all right, peace, deuces, we out. You know what I mean? Then you have like the new sportsbook deals and all these other things that are all a part of this. And you just saw the casino get rebranded downtown or in the CBD and all that. So there's all of that stuff that's all a part of this equation too, or that has at least some type of, vested interest in this equation as well. So you've got that. And then hopefully maybe we see something like that also clearly benefits what's going on with the Pels and them staying. And, there's always that conversation about them being relocated. I think there's more relocation conversation around the Pelicans than there is about the Saints, but there was always sort of the concern around, what happens with the Saints post Gayle Benson's ownership terms and all this stuff. Cause there ain't a lot of billionaires in the Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama area. You know what I mean? Like there's Gayle. And then there's the other person too. But everyone was always concerned about like that person having ownership and then it potentially moving the franchise and the franchise potentially moving. And this is what kind of helps with all that. So, okay, I've said enough. I've said enough about all that, but that's the idea here. So you should be happy. You should be happy, like, especially if this deal gets done. Jeff Duncan's done a fabulous job reporting on it. This is like such a Jeff Duncan story, So definitely keep an eye out on it, and we'll certainly keep you up to date with it as well. All right, so remember tomorrow we're looking midweek fundamentals, looking back at the offense, Clint Kubiak's offense, what it means for the New Orleans Saints. I wanna mention something now for you to keep in mind going into tomorrow's episode. Not only is it about motion, not only is it about play action, not only is it about all of these like bells, whistles, gadgets, all these other things that could potentially be added to this offense, but first and foremost, and above all else, competent play calling will make this work or not work. Competent offensive line play will make this work or not work. That's part of what we'll dive into tomorrow. How do you make sure that those things are taken care of? Just because some guy is running from one side of the field to the other before the snap doesn't mean that the play works. Right plays have to be called in the right game situations, all those other things. I have an idea in terms of how the New Orleans Saints will improve that part of the game. Sequencing, play calling, all that. So I want to dive into how important that's going to be for Clint Kubiak and this New Orleans Saints offense, while also diving into what the basics of this offense are, midweek fundamentals, and what we're expecting to see during training camp. Appreciate you as always. Making Locked On Saints your first listen of the day every day. Don't forget to go and check out Locked On Pelicans and Locked On LSU. Check in, see what else is going on around Locked On Louisiana. I know Matt's out at SEC Media Days and all that over at Locked On LSU, so definitely want to check in with that. I've already seen him interviewing so many different LSU players. definitely want to get in on all of that. We appreciate you very much. As always, make it Locked On Saints part of your day, part of your routine for saying yes to me on the show. As always, if you see me, please say hi. And if you need anything else around your New Orleans Saints in between these episodes, make sure you follow me on your favorite social media at Ross Jackson, NOLA. Hit me up. Let me know how the family's doing. Let me know how you living. Let me know how you momming them. I trust Who Dat Nation. I'll holla at you. Don't laugh.